You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 337, recorded on December 13th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week is Nate. Hello, Nate.
Great to be here, Bill.
So this week, Nate has joined me to talk about a book from the 19th century that a lot of real heads on the left know about, but is not necessarily something that gets a huge amount of discussion. So for some of you, this will be old material, but for a lot of you, this will be something you're just hearing about for the first time. I certainly didn't know a whole lot about it, and I don't think Nate knew a whole lot about it going into this either, except sort of the peripheral details about it. But we're going to be talking about Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward novel from 1888. This was a futurist utopian novel, which has been mostly forgotten in the United States, but had a pretty serious effect in the United States for at least a few years after its publication. And we'll talk a little bit about the book itself and some of the political impact that it had at the time, as well as some of the interesting ways in which you might have expected it to have more staying power versus ways in which it definitely doesn't hold up, and you can see why it kind of didn't stick around as long as people maybe thought that it was going to based on the initial reaction. So for this, I'm going to just briefly summarize who Edward Bellamy was and what the deal was with this book in terms of its publication. And then Nate actually has read the whole book in preparation for this episode and is going to be talking in more depth on the content of it. So Edward Bellamy was a guy from Massachusetts, wrote various things in his career as an author. I'm just going to go through the Wikipedia summary here of him, a little bit of him, just because that's the most concise way of doing it, and then we'll get into Nate's more detailed notes here. Bellamy retrospectively claimed that he did not write Looking Backward as a blueprint for political action, but rather sought to write a literary fantasy, a fairy tale of social felicity. The book inspired legions of readers to establish so-called nationalist clubs, beginning in Boston late in 1888. Bellamy's vision of a country relieved of its social ills through the abandonment of the principle of competition and establishment of state ownership of industry proved an appealing panacea to a generation of intellectuals alienated from the dark side of Gilded Age America. By 1891, it was reported that no fewer than 162 nationalist clubs were in existence. And we're going to circle back later in the episode to talk more in detail about those clubs. It's important to emphasize here, though, that the term nationalist, as Nate is going to explain, has more to do with the concept of nationalizing industries than, say, what we would currently think of as the concept of nationalism. Bellamy's use of the term nationalism rather than socialism as a descriptor of his governmental vision, at least in the book, was calculated, as he did not want to limit either sales of his novels or the potential influence of its political ideas. In an 1888 letter to literary critic William Dean Howells, Bellamy wrote, "Every sensible man will admit there is a big deal in a name, especially in making first impressions. In the radicalness of the opinions I have expressed, I may seem to out-socialize the socialists, yet the word socialist is one I could never well stomach. In the first place, it is a foreign word in itself, and equally foreign in all its suggestions. It smells to the average American of petroleum, suggests the red flag, and with all manner of sexual novelties, and an abusive tone about God and religion, which in this country we at least treat with respect. Whatever German and French reformers may choose to call themselves, socialist is not a good name for a party to succeed with in America. No such party can or ought to succeed that is not wholly and enthusiastically American and patriotic in spirit and suggestions." So that is obviously a continuing point of debate among not necessarily the left, but the broader sort of left liberal spectrum in the United States. That's a debate that probably preceded that and has continued since then. It's also one that we've talked a lot about on the history episodes that we've done here on Arsenal for Democracy over the past year or two. And so let's get into talking about the book itself specifically, so we can kind of understand why it had a big impact at the time and some of the ways that it's surprising that it hasn't had more impact to present day.
This is very much in the 19th century tradition of novels where you just have people give long speeches and stuff. Reading a quote from a friend of the show, the discourse lover Trilburn, he's saying, "It's actually pretty bad as literature and outdated, but I think poorly remembered given how massively influential it was." This is in response to him making a joke. Hashtag Star Trek 50, the only good science fiction is Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. Read a book, you nerds. So this is something that I feel like was mentioned in our high school history textbooks as an example of an influential novel of the time. It was the third largest bestseller of the time after Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, A Tale of Christ, and it had a profound impact on a lot of intellectuals at the time, and, sort of has influenced thought continuing on. Even looking at people like Eugene Debs, apparently was initially opposed to the Great Strikes of 1887, but he was influenced by Bellamy's books to turn to a more socialist direction, and eventually helped form the American Railway Union, and then, eventually that led to the Pullman strike. So, this book did have a serious influence. A lot of people were commenting on it. People made books in response to it, basically saying that, okay, well, this is fantastical, it'll never happen, or there are other utopias that got imagined in response to this utopia. And like I was saying, everyone from Daniel De Leon, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Upton Sinclair, a lot of these sort of ideas were being tossed around as a result of this book. So
yeah, it seems like that the book, although certainly not socialist, and we heard his arguments for why it wasn't socialist, had a profound impact on a lot of socialist politicians and political leaders, either people who were already starting to be well known or people who would, as you were just listing off, go on to be significant political figures. So even though this book wasn't explicitly socialist, can you walk us through, now that you've read it, some of the major ideas of it and also some of the interesting futurist details that people find so fascinating from a 21st century perspective, which of course people reading at the time wouldn't have any way of knowing how that was going to hold up or not?
Right, yeah. So basically, if anyone's ever seen the show Futurama, it's a very similar concept to that, where you have someone who is just relatively normal person. This guy, Julian West, is not a pizza delivery man like Fry in Futurama, but he does get hypnotized and basically frozen in a deep sleep, or however it works cryogenically, and moved from the year 1888 or around there, where he was about to get engaged or married to a woman, and basically he wakes up in the year 2000, and the United States is completely different. The city of Boston looks completely different, and basically it's been transformed into a system in which, not quite socialism as we've talked about, the way they put it is the era of trusts had been replaced with one big trust. They described the process of how that happened and how increasing productivity allowed things to be more centrally planned, and instead of lots of competition, the various smaller producers competing with each other to get a slightly better product, everything was sort of subsumed by these large conglomerates, which then started to operate with, I guess, better information and started cranking out just increasing productivity and production just because everything was sort of under one roof. And, you could debate about whether that would actually happen or not, but that's sort of the process that was described and how things changed. Just going into it, basically the novel is he meets this Dr. Leet, who shows Julian West all around the city and shows all the advances of the new age and explains why there have been these transformations within society. We'll talk about how a lot of these things that were predicted actually did come to pass, whether it's things like what he called the credit card. Now, the credit card basically functions like what we would call a debit card, but basically every citizen would get a universal basic income like allotment system from the government, which they would be able to spend however they wanted through the use of their credit cards. And
also maybe a little similar to EBT system, I guess.
Right, yeah, and they make the point, because Julian West is like, wait, but if everyone gets the same amount of money, why are the houses different sizes? Wouldn't everyone just be the same? And the doctor makes a point, no, you can choose to spend it on whatever you want. So some people like to have big houses, some will, enjoy vacations and things like that. And just it makes the point that it doesn't have to be all sort of like post-Soviet, everyone living in exactly the same apartment buildings and just everything's gray. Things can be pretty dynamic under the system, he predicted. So there's the credit cards, which obviously we still see. There was prediction of these warehouse cooperatives similar to like a Sam's Club, Costco, or BJ's, something like that, or maybe an Amazon warehouse. But this wasn't as much people toiling for little pay and more just like a large place where all of the materials were and people could come and get them. And so there was also, I'm even thinking about things like Spotify basically being predicted, because you had like rooms where music was being played. You could just touch the little button on the wall and there would be sermons playing as well, maybe like a podcast. These are just things that obviously people would have liked to have back in the 19th century, and now we have the technology to realize that. So I guess it's not too surprising that you have a music room where the room could play music nowadays. But back then, that's a pretty significant achievement. And then going on to sort of how the workforce is established, basically you had an army of industry where you would have industrial generals, and the president is basically the top industrial general. And this creates a system where you sort of stay in school until you're about, so I would say like 21, and then you serve in the industrial army for a period of time, basically until you become 45, at which point you can then retire and pursue other interests. So we'll get to that timeline in a sec. But I guess the basic detail is that, as Dr. Leeds says, the worker is not a citizen because he works. He works because he's a citizen. And of course, we'll talk about women's role in the workplace as well and how equal it was. But this was sort of the general thought. It's like, well, we're all in this together, so we're all going to work and try to better each other. And so there's even things like everyone takes a turn serving as a waiter, for example. And because everyone serves at one point, it is respected. Whereas back in the day, and they make the point, it's like, oh, yeah, no one would be a server if they could not have to. But, you know,
this is like those left Twitter discussions about everyone should have to do a service job or a retail job or something like that for at least a year or two before they weigh in on political matters.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it basically creates a system where people actually value their work because they're not as alienated from it. So therefore, there's nothing inherently degrading necessarily about bringing someone their food at a restaurant. That's a necessary job as part of the kitchen, right? But the thing is, if you're having to break your back for tips or rude customers or things like that, then of course you're going to be degraded by that sort of work. So if everyone gets a turn, then that's much more of a, you get to actually experience what that's like, and then maybe you're not as rude to your servers. So just getting another part here, at one point, Julian West finds a work of Charles Dickens, which they have saved in the year 2000. They talk about why the citizens of the future really like Charles Dickens, actually. And I'll read the quote here. Judged by our standards, he overtops all the writers of his age, not because his literary genius was the highest, but because his great heart beat for the poor, because he made the cause of victims of society his own, and devoted his pen to exposing its cruelties and shams. No man of his time did so much as he did to turn men's minds to the wrong and wretchedness of the old order of things, and open their eyes to the necessity of the great change that was coming, although he himself did not clearly foresee it. If you think about the works of Charles Dickens or whatever, it's pretty obvious that's what comes through, and what would come through to, you know, a futuristic society, that, oh, he actually recognized the flaws in his current society and was advocating for change.
The inhumanity of it. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, this novel, looking backward, ended up being one of the most popular best-selling novels in American history, at least up to that time, and one of the other really influential ones and best-selling ones was, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is similarly, as with the Dickens works, that was something that was turning public attention to, through literature and fiction, to a grave social ill, something immoral.
Right, exactly. There are all sorts of other situations as well. We talked about the situation where you retire at age 45 and then continue to enjoy your interests. As Dr. Lee says, it's basically the new 21. And to quote the doctor, we have simply added a common school system of compulsory education in vogue in Massachusetts 100 years ago, a half dozen higher grades, carrying the youth to the age of 21 and giving him what you used to call the education of a gentleman, instead of turning him loose at 14 or 15 with no mental equipment beyond reading, writing, and the multiplication table. And he also goes on a little diatribe about how college is free and its cost was inflated in the 19th century, which is pretty hilarious to think about now.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this sounds like a universal, K through 16 for free, right?
Yeah, and it is kind of funny where it's like, yeah, age 18, we got nothing for you unless you want to go to college. Meanwhile, like, you're still, like, not actually an adult at age 18. You're just physically one, but you're mentally not one for another, like, 7 years, basically. So it seems like there could be some further education required, but yeah.
I like this idea, though, that 45 is the new 21, because at 21, you finish your education and move on to the next phase of your life, which is to serve in this industrial army. And then after 45, your term of service in the industrial army is done. You get to retire and go do whatever with your free choice and whatever money you've saved, or however you want to use it.
Yeah, pursue your own interests, whether if you have artistic interests or you want to write or explore. So that's sort of how that was set up. Could talk a little bit about the jury and the legal system. There's basically no legal profession anymore. There's no jury system either, but there are like judges and magistrates that I think are term limited and they rotate. So we've been talking a lot about prison abolition, things like that. The Charlestown prison was noticeably gone. That's something that Julian West noticed. And basically, they've said that criminality is atavism. They thought that was the root there in the future, and that's not as much used as a concept anymore, but I guess that was sort of in vogue then, the concept of atavism. Obviously, there wouldn't be no crime ever or whatever, but this sort of establishes a scenario where the criminality is pretty minor just because most people have their basic needs attended to.
Right.
So
that
you can deal with the actual psychos.
Fear and desperation, you take that away, now your crime is a lot reduced, presumably.
Yeah, and so also, so I'll read some quotes by Dr. Leet, how he saw the 19th century and sort of how, I guess, the problem for Bellamy was there was all this competition that led to people being out of work. Of course, this is in the time where you had something like the Army of Labor, and you just had like a lot of people out of work because of the booms and busts and crashes of the various trusts. And, this was a pretty volatile time. And was this something like the Long Depression of the...
Yes, this was during the Long Depression.
Right. So, this is a very volatile time. There's lots of strikes, labor action, Pinkertons or whatever being hired. So this is sort of the area that Bellamy, the context he was in. And at one point in the book, they say that, actually the socialists and anarchists were being hired by capital in order to make the radicals look bad or whatever, which, yeah. So, but let's read some quotes here. So, the producers of the 19th century were not like ours, working together for the maintenance of the community, but each solely for his own maintenance at the expense of the community. If, in working to this end, he at the same time increased the aggregate wealth, that was merely incidental. It was just as feasible and as common to increase one's private hoard by practices injurious to the general welfare. The daydream of the 19th century producer was to gain absolute control of the supply of some necessity of life so that he may keep the public at verge of starvation. Famine prices for what he supplied. This, Mr. West, is what was called the 19th century system of production. And then referring to the business crises and unemployment, he says, moreover, every change in the adjustments of business, every slight alteration in the condition of commerce or manufactures, not to speak of the innumerable business failures that took place yearly, even in the best of times, were constantly throwing a multitude of men out of employment for periods of weeks or months or even years. The great number of these seekers of employment were constantly traveling the country, becoming professional vagabonds in time and then criminals. Give us work was the cry of the army of unemployed at nearly all seasons. And in seasons of dullness in business, this army swelled to a host so vast and desperate as to threaten the stability of the government. Yeah, that's sort of how they're looking at it and how Bellamy himself is interpreting the era, sort of saying like, well, if we don't sort of do something here, there's going to be a huge problem and maybe the government will come down or something just because there are all these strikes. And overall, I guess he sort of becomes more sympathetic to the strikes. He's reading an old newspaper that, says that the capital were the ones paying the socialists and anarchists to strike. It wasn't a labor party that formed this new society, but rather the National Party. But this is very clearly not a labor party that founds this new government.
Right, so let's talk briefly about that. As we said, by 1891, there were at least 162 nationalist clubs across the country. Most of these originated from Boston, where he was based and where the book is based. These were mostly middle-class dominated clubs, and they sort of filtered out across the rest of the country. Some areas like California had much greater numbers of clubs than, say, New York State. As we said, these clubs proved fairly influential or important to a number of socialist politicians, either at the time or people who would subsequently rise to prominence. And there was an attempt by a lot of these clubs to start a sort of national party like in the book, and that kind of fizzled out unexpectedly because there was the 1893 economic crisis and then also the so-called People's Party that most of you would probably know more commonly as the populist movement, which emerged around the same time and had much more grassroots support, and so they sort of ended up kind of blurring together. There's two sort of central critiques of the nationalist clubs and the book looking backward, some of which he attempted to address in the sequel. There's basically a tactical critique and a ideological critique. Again, these are going to sound like pretty familiar themes to some of the debates in the left liberal spectrum today. The tactical critique is that These were these middle-class clubs that were obsessed with a book and were going to, as with Uncle Tom's Cabin, try to moralize their way out of a problem that was fundamentally material. As some of you may know, and is something we'll probably talk about next year in more depth on the show, one of the central problems the abolitionist movement had in the United States in the pre-Civil War era is that moralizing about slavery did not really motivate a lot of people, showing that slavery was going to replace wage labor workers eventually if the industrialization of slavery, which began with the cotton gin, continued, and those enslaved workers became more of a direct threat to wage workers, which may or may not have happened, but that was a persuasive argument at the time that got a lot of workers in the North to come around on the issue of needing to get rid of slavery, that at the very least that the political system was going to be controlled by slavers if it wasn't abolished, and that was not going to be good for them. That's a tactical critique. The ideological critique is that this is not a leftist program that he's advocating for. It's definitely hostile. If you're a liberal, you're critiquing this. It's definitely hostile to the notion of trust busting, which is the direction a lot of liberals went subsequent to this or had already started going in that direction. But if you're on the left, it ends up being kind of influential to say, yeah, maybe the answer to a tendency toward one giant industrial cartel and monopoly is to have that monopoly in the hands of the workers themselves. Now, Bellamy's version of this, at least in the first book, is this very undemocratic, arguably authoritarian vision of the post-Civil War American army, the early sort of industrial army, and there was starting to be this in Europe as well, of course, at the same time, eventually leading to World War I. But this idea of that you'd have this industrial army, a literal army, step into the political arena and establish a military government to fix this situation after the instability of all these strikes that he was projecting, where that was going to go. And so there was a lot of people critiquing that and saying, well, this isn't really exactly a workers' government or, a socialist government. You're hoping that the alignment and ideology of that military regime is more in this direction for the popular benefit than not. And that was something that I think troubled a lot of people. So that was, I think, a central critique. Were there any other critiques that you wanted to emphasize, Nate, that he did try to address in the sequel, although you didn't, I think, read that one?
Right. Well, the sequel is actually basically sort of more explanation of how things came to pass. So apparently it goes more in depth about that, but it's quite boring because...
World building.
Yeah, because it's just a lot of more speeches and stuff. But the sequel, Equality, goes much more into the rights of women, which are talked about. We should get into it about in looking backwards, but it sort of more fleshes out the world, but does show how women are in a equal role in the workplace. So apparently in the sequel, Julian, he ends up marrying the daughter of the doctor, who is also a descendant of his fiance back in the past. And then he also has a nightmare where he goes back to the 19th century, but it turns out he's really in the 20th century now. Anyway, but for example, the manager of a paper factory that he visits with Edith is a woman. She herself is working as part of the general labor period before choosing a trade. And so it sort of goes into how the women who are fully the same involved in the industrial army, the only caveat that's made is that they get some of the work that is not as backbreaking or whatever, just in terms of, making sure what's efficient, and you're not trying to make women just haul giant rocks or something like that. And there's a female general in chief who has basically a veto on the cabinet over the president on women's issues or things that would affect women. So she can basically exercise her power there. The credit card amount is all the same for men and women. And it also goes a little bit more into male-female relations or dating, things like that, and explains how compared to the 19th century, women are much more open about their interest in men. Also predicts involuntary celibate people. To read a quote, "Celibates nowadays are almost invariable men who have failed to acquit themselves with credibility in the work of life. The woman must be a courageous one, with a very evil sort of courage too, whom pity for these unfortunates should lead to defy the opinions for generation, for otherwise she is free so far as to accept him as a husband." So just sort of interesting things that get raised, and then we sort of see what it's like now. So yeah, and then we go into more just other different things about this next world. Everyone is now vegetarian. Everybody wears basically paper clothes that can be recycled when dirty. There's really no more jewelry anymore because there's no point. They basically invented like a television called an electroscope. Basically, there's like a universal language, I guess like Esperanto or binary or something. There's all sorts of just intertwined things that we can see. It's like they were grasping at something back then. They didn't really know what it would be like, but they sort of did quite nail it just in terms of like, well, if you think about this, how well things develop, yeah, I guess it would make sense to have a room where you could play music or like a button where it hits the Spotify playlist or something. So there's also air cars.
Well, you got to have air cars. I mean, that's a classic futurist trope.
But I don't want air cars, really. I mean, it seems dangerous.
Me either.
The self-driving car, that's been a disaster. Don't need that.
All right. Well, Nate, thank you so much for reading Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy and going over this important piece of American sort of left and liberal history that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention as it should have.
Just one last thing, just regarding the sequel. And as we talked about, a lot of people found it actually more democratic and populist than Looking Backward, which was much more technocratic. So we have two people, John Dewey, he said he preferred equality, calling it more populist and democratic than the more popular and authoritarian Looking Backwards. And anarchist Peter Kropotkin said the book was more favorable because it had removed the authoritarian elements. He thought that if someone suitable had conversed with Bellamy, he could have convinced him to become an anarchist. So you see a lot of different people sort of squabbling or looking to take parts of these texts to sort of bolster their political thoughts or movements or whatever. So, I mean, it was clearly just a very influential book, and I'm glad I got a chance to read it, even if it's like a little bit dry and antiquated. But definitely, I think people should check this out, just sort of like the novelty of the things it predicted or the world that it envisioned.
Thanks so much.
All right. Have a great one, Bill.